Before we get to the story, I'd like to say thanks so much for visiting my new channel. I'm going to be uploading cosmic horror related stories every single day. So if that sounds good, please drop a like and don't forget to subscribe. It means a lot, especially when just getting started. I hope you enjoy the story. There's a particular kind of wrong that takes training to see. Most people look at a stretch of coastline and see rocks and water and maybe a nice view. I look at the same stretch and see a record. Every feature has a reason. Every rock formation, every curve of the shoreline, every place where the land drops off or rises up tells you something about how it got that way. Geology is just history, written in a language most people never learn to read. I've been reading it for 15 years, which is why when I saw what had happened to the coastline outside Becker's Point, I couldn't make myself believe it. Not at first, not for a while. My name is Jules, and I work coastal survey and erosion assessment for a state geological office on the Pacific coast. My job is to measure things, compare them to previous measurements, and explain the difference. Usually, the difference is small, and the explanation is straightforward. Erosion, storm damage, seasonal shift in sand deposits. The coastline changes constantly. That's the whole point of my job. Change is expected. What is not expected is for 2 miles of coastline to physically rearrange itself between one evening and the following morning, with no storm, no seismic event, and no explanation that holds up past the first question. I got the call on a Wednesday. A local county surveyor named Bright had gone out to do a routine access assessment along the coastal path near Becker's Point and had come back to the office looking, by his own description, like he'd seen something he needed someone else to confirm before he put it in writing. He called our office because we had the comparison records going back decades, the baseline measurements that would tell you definitively whether what he was seeing was new. I drove out the next morning. Becker's Point is a stretch of the Northern California coast that doesn't get much attention. No major beaches, no tourism infrastructure, just a long reach of rocky shoreline with a coastal path running above it and a small fishing community about 3 miles inland. The geology there is interesting if you know what you're looking at. Older rock pushed up through younger deposits, a formation that takes thousands of years to produce. Bright met me at the trailhead and we walked the path together. He didn't say much on the way out, just let me see it for myself. I saw it within the first 10 minutes. The rock shelf that ran along the base of the coastal bluff had moved. I know how that sounds. Rock shelves don't move. That's the whole definition of bedrock. It's a thing that stays. But the formation I was looking at was not where the survey records said it should be. The records I'd pulled before driving out showed a specific shelf edge at a specific position, confirmed by 3 separate surveys over the past 20 years. What I was standing above was that same shelf, identifiable by its shape and composition, sitting roughly 14 feet further out from shore than it had any right to be. Further out, in one section. In another section, about a quarter mile down the path, the shoreline had pulled inward. A small cove that showed clearly on the comparison photos was partially filled in. The rocks that had defined its mouth now sitting in new positions, rearranged like furniture. I walked the full 2 miles with my measuring equipment, and Bright walked with me. Neither of us talked much. The data came in the way data does. when you really don't want it to, clean and consistent and stubbornly real. When we finished, I sat on a rock above the waterline and looked at my readings, and then looked at the coastline and tried to find the error, not in the data, in my interpretation of it. I went through every natural process I knew that could produce coastal change on this scale and checked them against the conditions. No storm. The Weather Service records for the previous week showed nothing significant. A light rain on Sunday, calm conditions through Wednesday. No seismic event. The nearest monitoring station had recorded nothing above background noise for the past month. No evidence of a large wave event. No debris line. No sand displacement patterns consistent with surge. The rocks hadn't been tumbled or carried. They were sitting in their new positions with the same stability as rocks that had been there for years. The coastline had moved. Something had moved it. And whatever that something was, it had done it quietly, overnight, without leaving the kind of evidence that natural processes always leave behind. I spent the afternoon in the county records office pulling every coastal survey document they had for the Becker's Point stretch, going back as far as the filing system reached. Bright sat across from me and worked through a second stack. It was slow, and the older records were inconsistent in their formatting. Different surveyors using different reference points, and it took time to line them up against each other in a way that was meaningful. I found the first one late in the afternoon, buried in a folder from about 60 years back. A survey note, handwritten, describing a discrepancy in the Becker's Point shoreline measurements that the surveyor had been unable to account for. He'd written it off as a reference point error and noted that the previous surveyor had likely used a different baseline marker. His explanation was tidy and reasonable, and I was certain it was wrong, because the discrepancy he'd described was in the same section of coastline, and it was directionally consistent with what I was looking at now. The same stretch, the same kind of shift, 60 years ago. I kept digging. The records got thinner the further back I went, less systematic, more gaps than data. But I found 2 more references that matched the pattern, each one decades apart, each one in the same location, each one explained away by the surveyor who found it as measurement error or equipment inconsistency. The kind of explanation that looks reasonable in isolation and only looks like avoidance when you line them all up together. I didn't say anything to Bright about it that evening. I needed to sit with it first. The Coastal Survey Office had a contract with a marine research firm for offshore sonar work, the kind of deep water mapping that helps predict erosion by showing you what the seafloor looks like adjacent to the shoreline. I filed a request the next morning for an offshore sonar run along the Becker's Point stretch. Standard procedure after a significant coastal change event. Nothing that would raise flags. The results came back 2 days later, and I looked at them for a long time before I called anyone. The seafloor charts for the area showed a flat continental shelf running out from the coastline, which was what the existing charts showed and what you'd expect for that stretch of coast. What the new readings showed was different. Directly adjacent to the section of coastline that had shifted, the seafloor was not flat. It was uneven in a way that the existing charts did not account for. A large irregular feature sitting on the shelf that the previous surveys had not recorded. Either the previous surveys had missed it, which was possible, but unlikely given the size of it, or it had not been there the last time anyone looked. The feature was big. I won't try to give you exact dimensions because the sonar resolution at that depth has limits, but big enough that its presence on the shelf should have shown up on routine maritime charts. Big enough that I sat looking at the return image for most of an afternoon trying to figure out what category of thing it fit into. It didn't fit cleanly into any category I had. There's a small fishing operation out of Becker's Point, maybe a dozen boats working out of a weathered dock at the base of the coastal road. I drove down there on a Friday afternoon because I needed local knowledge, and local knowledge in coastal areas lives on the docks. A fisherman named Ruiz was working on his boat when I arrived, a compact and weathered man who'd been running the same stretch of water for most of his life. I introduced myself and explained what I was working on and asked if he'd noticed anything unusual offshore recently. He set down the line he was working on and looked at me with the expression of someone who has been waiting for a particular conversation. The water had been wrong for about 3 weeks, he said. Wrong temperature. There was an upwelling about 1.5 miles out that didn't match any seasonal pattern he knew, and he'd been fishing these waters for over 20 years. Warm water pushing up from below, sitting on the surface in a way that drew certain fish toward it and pushed others away. He'd adjusted his routes around it because the fish he was after didn't like it. He also told me the water above it looked different. Not dramatically, not something you'd notice if you weren't on the water every day, but a slight surface disturbance, an inconsistency in the chop, like something underneath was affecting how the water sat. I asked him how large the area was, and he described a radius that matched almost exactly with the offshore sonar feature. I asked him if it had ever happened before, in his experience, or in anything he'd heard from older fishermen. He thought about it for a moment and then said that his father, who had fished the same water, had mentioned a period when he was young, when the offshore conditions had been unusual in the same way. He didn't know the details, just that his father had considered certain areas off limits for a season, and then they'd gone back to normal. I thanked him and drove back to the office and sat in the parking lot for a while before going inside. I arranged for a research boat through the marine firm on the following Tuesday. A small vessel, 2 crew, equipped with a hull-mounted sonar unit that could take direct readings rather than the remote sweep we'd already run. I wanted to be directly above that seafloor feature, and I wanted better resolution than the first survey had given me. We went out in the morning, calm water, light overcast. The boat captain was a practical woman named Chev, who'd done this kind of work before and who asked good questions and didn't ask unnecessary ones. I told her where I needed to be, and she got us there. We ran the sonar for about 2 hours, working a grid over the coordinates, building up a picture of the seafloor feature that was more detailed than the first survey. What it showed was something large and not uniform, not a geological formation in any sense I recognized, without the regular pattern of a reef structure or the gradual slope of a sediment deposit. It had edges, not sharp edges, but defined ones, places where the feature ended and the flat shelf resumed. It was a thing sitting on the shelf rather than a feature of the shelf. I was working through the readings when Chev said, quietly, that I should come look at the depth display. The depth below us was listed in our charts as just under 300 feet. The display was reading 160. The bottom was 140 feet closer to the surface than it should have been. I looked at the sonar image and the depth reading and put them together and understood that the feature I was looking at was not sitting flat on the shelf. It was rising, not dramatically, not in any way you'd see from the surface, but the depth readings across the grid showed it was highest at the center and sloped down toward the edges, and the center was 140 feet shallower than the surrounding shelf. The center of it was less than 160 feet below the hull of our boat. I was still working through that when I felt something come through the hull. I want to describe it accurately. It wasn't a noise, it wasn't a wave, it was a transmission, a low and sustained vibration that I felt in the soles of my feet and in my hands where they rested on the console that lasted about 15 seconds and then stopped. Chev felt it too. She looked at me and I looked at her, and we both looked at the water. From offshore, looking back toward the coast, we watched the Becker's Point shoreline change. It wasn't violent. That's the part that stays with me. It was slow and almost quiet, a section of the rocky shelf near the base of the bluff shifting outward, a low sound reaching us across the water that was somewhere between a crack and a groan, and then the water around the new position churning briefly as displaced rock settled. A small section, smaller than the first event, maybe 50 feet of shoreline, but the same motion, the same direction, the same coastline adjusting itself to accommodate something that had pushed up from below. We watched it settle. The water went calm again. The coastline held its new position. Chev had the engines running before I said anything. I filed my report the following week. I included the comparison surveys, the historical records going back through the decades, the offshore sonar readings, and the depth anomaly, and my account of the second shift event. I wrote it as plainly as I could, and I used language that my office was comfortable with, terms that had professional weight without making the report sound like something that would get filed in the wrong drawer. The official response came back inside of 10 days. The coastal changes were classified as geological activity of undetermined origin, pending further review. A monitoring schedule was proposed, automated sensors placed at intervals along the affected stretch, readings to be reviewed quarterly. The offshore sonar data was forwarded to a university research department for analysis. I had a phone call with my supervisor about the historical pattern I'd found, the recurring shifts going back through the survey records. He listened, and he didn't dismiss it, and he said it would be included in the long-term analysis. He said these things moved on geological timescales, and that long intervals between events were consistent with deep crustal processes. I didn't argue. He wasn't wrong that long intervals were consistent with deep crustal processes. He was wrong about what was causing it, but I didn't have the language to explain that in a way that would survive a professional review, and I knew it. I went back 6 weeks later to check on the sensor readings and to continue my own survey work on the second shift area. The sensors were running fine. The coastline had not changed again. The affected sections had settled, and there was already the beginning of biological activity on the newly positioned rock surfaces. The first algae taking hold, the slow work of the ocean reasserting itself over a change. I pulled the updated offshore sonar from the monitoring buoy that had been placed at the site. I sat in my car in the parking area above the coastal path and looked at the readings on my laptop. The feature had moved, not by a large amount, not dramatically, but the coordinates of its highest point, the center of it, had shifted toward the shore by a measurable distance. Whatever was sitting on that shelf below the surface had moved up the shelf, closer to the coastline, in 6 weeks. The depth at the new center point was 130 feet. I sat there for a while, looking at that number. 130 feet isn't shallow. It's not something that surfaces. But 6 weeks ago, it was 160, and before that, before the first coastal event, the chart said it should have been 300. It had come up 170 feet in the time I'd been watching. I don't know the timescale on the next event. I don't know if the movement up the shelf means the events will come closer together, or if it's just repositioning between a cycle that runs on a clock I can't read. The historical pattern didn't give me enough data points to work out the intervals precisely, and the intervals may not even be regular. What I know is what the depth readings tell me. Something very large has been in that water for long enough that the coastline above it shows its influence going back through every survey record I could find. It moves on its own schedule, and it doesn't adjust that schedule for anything happening on shore. The land moves because something below makes the land move, the same way the surface of a lake moves when something large shifts in the depths beneath it. We recorded it. We put sensors on it. We called it undetermined geological activity and scheduled a quarterly review. I go back every few weeks anyway, outside of the official monitoring schedule, and I check the depth readings from the buoy. The number keeps changing, not every time. Some visits it holds steady, and I let myself believe the movement has stopped. Then I come back the next week, and the shelf is shallower than it was. Last time I was out there, I stood on the coastal path above the first shift area and looked at the water and thought about Ruiz, the fisherman, and his father's stories about a season when the offshore water was wrong. The season ended. Things went back to normal. That's the part people hold on to. That it ended. That normal came back. What I keep thinking about is the part in between. The part where something that operates on a scale that makes the coastline shift, like furniture, was close enough to the surface that a fisherman on a small boat could feel the water sitting wrong above it. The depth reading last week was 112 feet. I keep checking. That's all I can do at this point. I keep checking, and I watch the number, and I try to figure out at what depth it becomes something other than a geological record. I haven't figured that out yet. I'm working on it.